Police have detained protesters in Shanghai as protests over China's stringent COVID-19 restrictions flared for a third day and spread to several cities in the wake of a deadly fire in the country's far west. Protesters were also seen gathered in the streets of Shanghai and singing the national anthem. The wave of civil disobedience is unprecedented in mainland China since President Xi Jinping assumed power a decade ago. A frustration mounts over his signature zero COVID-19 policy nearly 3 years into the pandemic. Fire on Thursday at a residential high-rise building in the city of Unrest, capital of the Xinjiang region, triggered protests after videos of the incident posted on social media led to accusations that lockdowns were a factor in the blaze that killed 10 people. By Sunday evening, hundreds of people had gathered in the area, some jostled with police trying to disperse them. People held up blank sheets of paper as an expression of protest. Thembisa Fakude is a senior research fellow at the Africa-Asia Dialogues. He joins us now for more on this. A very good evening to you, Thembisa, and thank you so much for speaking to us. As we mentioned, unusual scenes in terms of large-scale protests in China. How far do you think it will unravel?
Well, it seemed to be expanding. It started in Xinjiang, then it moved to Wuhan, and yesterday we heard that it was in Shanghai and in some other cities in China. So it seemed to be expanding, and I think it's going to go ahead. This is almost the third day, and it doesn't seem to be subsiding. So more and more people are joining in this protest. So it looks like it's going to be going ahead. And we've had, of course, the escalation of this protest. Now, some protesters calling for the resignation of Xi Jinping and the CCP, which is the Communist Party of China.
Just speaking about the CCP and the call for President Xi to step down, what do you think is the likelihood, considering that he's seen as having strengthened his stranglehold in power? And we spoke about the excessive zero COVID measures that have been underway since COVID. What is the likelihood of him, heeding this call?
Well, it's not going to happen, as we know. As you said, that it's just been given unprecedented powers, and the CCP is well entrenched in China. So these are just tactics by the protesters to push the boundaries. But we all know that is not going to happen, that Xi Jinping will leave power. But of course, it's on a back foot at the moment, having been forced yesterday to relax some of those COVID-19 restrictions, and he is likely to, as the Chinese official statement said today, that they are likely to look at relaxing some of the COVID-19 restrictions. So he's on a back foot, and the CCP is also on a back foot. And the protests, for the first time, they feel emboldened. Many people are saying that this might be a repeat of Tiananmen Square, but many of these people that are protesting because of the restrictions in China don't even know about Tiananmen Square. They're just reacting out of the frustration of 3 years of basically being in prison in their own homes.
I found that comparison quite interesting, especially when speaking about the fact that you had students who themselves were protesting at universities, but Tiananmen Square and what actually happened there was obviously one of the darkest periods for China. Can it compare to that? Some areas we know have been under lockdown for the past 4 months. This centralized quarantine and this zero COVID policy. How do they stack up against that period in history, considering that the Chinese government is saying we're doing all we can to make sure that we keep people alive?
Well, firstly, Tiananmen Square is not really well known in China compared to the outside world because of the close control of the flow of information in China. Very few people know about Tiananmen Square, particularly the generation that's currently protesting. So that's the first point. The second point is that, 3 years of lockdown and 3 years of COVID restrictions was likely to produce the type of frustration that we're seeing. So this is homegrown, is out of frustration, and it's got a lot to do. Some are arguing that during these 3 years, Chinese young people have been spending a lot of time on the internet, and as a result, got to know about what's been going on, for example, in Hong Kong and what's going on in other parts of the world, including certain freedoms that have been deprived of. So the 3 years is coming back to haunt China and is backlashing against Xi Jinping and his government, because now the same young people are saying we want more freedoms, and because they don't know much about what's been happening in their own country, including the Tiananmen Square events, they're willing to risk it all, not knowing what had happened in terms of that harsh crackdown that took place in 1989.
And just looking at the figures in China, in the United States. In China, they're saying they're record numbers, but we know that the US, the COVID-19 resurgence figures, they are said to be far greater. For those of us who are watching, in terms of precautionary measures, should we be thinking of going back to mask wearing, or at least to being extra careful, affecting our own sort of quarantining in ways that we can?
Well, the strange thing, of course, is that China has experienced over the past couple of days, a week, at least a week and a half or so, they've experienced over 40,000 new infections daily. So notwithstanding, people are still saying, no, we want our freedoms, at least going out and leading a normal life back. So that's the first point. The second point is that notwithstanding that the entire world has opened up, besides the continuing COVID-19 infections, China has insisted on the zero COVID infection rate policy. And I think that has also triggered this anxiety within China. But I don't see ourselves going back to that period in 2020, 2021, where there were heavy restrictions on COVID-19. I think we are likely to go ahead. The best that we can do, as most countries are pushing forward with, including the United States, is to increase the boost rate. In other words, those people who have COVID-19, who have gone on to get injections, they must go ahead and get boosters. And that's what China has been trying to do in the United States. But unfortunately in China, the level of boosters are much more lower, particularly to the vulnerable communities. You're talking about 2/3 of those that are vulnerable who have gone on to get the boosters. So the move in the world at the moment is for boosting, not to go back to those restrictions that we had initially in 2020.
All right. So no hard lockdowns anticipated, but in terms of opportunity, it comes at a time in South Africa and the UK say they've signed a science and health agreement recently with President Robert Ramaphosa was there. What opportunities exist, particularly for developing nations, if we're to ride this particular wave and come out of it much better off while we watch the situation as it develops elsewhere?
Well, I think the impact, particularly economic impact of COVID-19, will make any government think twice when it comes to returning back to those restrictions that we had in 2020 and 2021. So, and in Africa, by the way, we've proven somehow to be, we came up quite tops compared to many countries when it comes to deaths and infections of COVID-19. And it was a lesson for many African countries. And I think the African governments in particular, and in South Africa, they will really, really think twice, having suffered when we're still trying to recover from COVID-19 of 2020, all the variants that we've had. And I don't think President Cyril Ramaphosa will actually look at reverting back to those hard lockdown restrictions that we've had in 2020 and 2021.
All right. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Thembisa Fakude is a Senior Research Fellow at the Africa-Asia Dialogues.